Hello everybody and welcome. So this is module 1, and as I mentioned within the syllabus, the modules that I will be covering as a PowerPoint are going to serve as a kind of guide for whatever I believe is the most important concepts and kind of the most important parts of the modules coming from the textbook. So in a way, although I wouldn't be able to include everything from the textbook modules, this is kind of what I believe to be the most important aspects that you should probably want to focus on as you review for the quizzes and for the exams. So module 1 on the history and the scope of psychology. So this is what I will be covering in this presentation. So first of all, how did psychology began as its own field, as a science, as a social science. Next, we're gonna move on to one of the biggest questions within psychology and within other sciences as well, that of nature versus nurture, and we're gonna see kind of what we mean there and some of the potential examples that actually apply to psychology. Then we're going to talk about the 3 levels of analysis used within psychology, which we'll be using throughout this class as we go on, and we're going to use different examples of it as well. Then talking about the different subfields of psychology, and finish talking about a particular study method that you can use for this class or for other classes as well. So who were the first people the first groups of individuals to ask questions about the mind, about the brain, and about the relationship between mind and body. Well, these were kind of early Greek philosophers, particularly people like Aristotle, who had some basic ideas about, again, the connection between the body and the mind and how these work together. However, even though we know that Aristotle was a really smart and intelligent person, individual, and that he had a lot of great insights and he generated a lot of knowledge that uh, we even these days can apply to different contexts. He had a limited amount of knowledge, and he also had limited ways as to how to acquire this knowledge, right? So having said that, his best way of making this trying to come up with these intelligent questions was just based on making guesses, right? And again, due to a limitation on the, in a way, on the amount of knowledge, but also on the kind of equipment, technology, and so forth that was available at the time, which was close to zero, as we know. Then a significant contribution to psychology as a field was made by a researcher by the last name of Wundt. And Wundt is in fact regarded as the person who started the first research laboratory in psychology, and this actually happening in Germany toward the end of the 19th century. And again, he's regarded as a person establishing the first psychological research lab, and he introduced two key elements that actually help psychology to advance as a science. The first one being making careful observations, which also needed to be systematic, right? So not only making careful observations, so an observation is any piece of information that you collect in these people, in this instance, in psychology is going to be typically about people, right? So this could be through an actual experiment, through surveys and so forth, right? So making those observations in really systematic way, so making those observations in the same way each time in careful manners. And secondly, the use of experimental methods to establish and to, in a way, draw better conclusions based on psychological data. And we're gonna see what's kind of the more formal definition of what an experiment is later on the following modules, because specific features need to be in place for a particular study to be considered a type of experiment or an actual experiment per se. And indeed, uh, one classic experiment by Wundt was based on the difference between sensation and perception. So first of all, he asked people to push a button when they heard a ball dropping on a table on a platform, and he noticed that people took about 1/10 of a second to notice this sound. However, then he gave these people a slightly different instruction. So now it was to push this button whenever they became consciously aware of hearing the ball hitting the platform, right? So now with this slight change in the instruction, he noticed that people took about 2/10 of a second to react to this instruction, right? So as you can see, what you can see in this example, kind of just noticing whenever the ball fell on the platform, what you can see on your left hand of the screen, that represents sensation, right? So whenever we sense something, whenever we first kind of hear something, kind of feel like we just touch something that we can sense the texture, the temperature of an object, and so forth. Well, that's what's termed and what's considered sensation. On the other hand, whenever our brain, in a way, interprets this amount of information, in this case, a given sound, that represents perception, right? So again, this study kind of just reflected and exemplified the main difference between, again, sensation and perception. And indeed, that's why these reaction times were slightly different from one another when it comes to response times. Now, speaking more about kind of different schools of thought that originated early within psychology, we had that Edward Titchener used data from introspection. So he was kind of a big proponent of introspection as one of the ways in which you could actually collect information about a given individual. So introspection refers to how people may report about sensations and other elements of their own experience, right? So this means that people are going to be asked about what's going on their minds, what is it that they're feeling, right? About their emotions, etc. And then people are going to report back to somebody, right? The experimenter or the researcher, about how this mental life, about how it actually looks like, right? The problem with the use of introspection is that, as you can probably infer, this represents a very subjective way of collecting information. Why? Because what you might interpret as a particular emotion as maybe a sadness, or what you might describe as a given sensation or feeling and so forth, might be very different from whatever somebody else feels like, what it actually feels like being sad and so forth, right? So it is very difficult to make systematic observation based on introspection, right? So having said that, introspection was a sort of good kind of initial method to collect information from individuals at this really early stage of psychology. Then came structuralism, which based itself on introspection, however, with a focus on looking at the structure of the mind and kind of the different maybe ways in which different parts of the brain, in which different ways of thinking can give us an insight into the understanding of the human mind and of the human experience and of the, in a way, a psychological perspective from a given individual. Then you have functionalism, in which the focus is not so much on the structures of the brain and the structures of the mind per se, but mostly on the actual psychological processes that help us to survive as individuals and to, in a way, be who we are and being able to communicate with others, right? So the idea is that uh, it is not so much what the brain looks like. That's not the most important aspect to consider, or different, in a way, theoretical parts of the brain and so forth. But the most important piece of information is how actually the brain works and how is that helping us to function properly as individuals. Then here we have a very important individual of the name William James, who is regarded as the first American psychologist. So the first psychologist in the U.S. Even though he was initially and kind of formally trained as a philosopher, given the kind of work that he conducted and his writings and so forth, he again became regarded as a very prominent psychologist, and he actually wrote a very important textbook called the Fundamentals of Psychology, which, if you were to take a look at this textbook, you will notice that it is very similar to the textbook that you have for this class. So it will be similar to an Introduction to Psychology textbook, because it covers a lot of domains within psychology that he believed were to be regarded as of interest to other psychologists, and that research within these areas and subfields within psychology should be taken into account, and again, kind of well researched. Now, as you have seen so far, the as I mentioned, given that William James was regarded as the first American psychologist, this means that most of the other people that conducted research and who actually were part of the field came from European countries mostly, and we're gonna see some of the famous people here in a minute. So mostly people coming from Europe, right? And even more than that, of course, the field was completely dominated by men, by male researchers, right? So this is why we introduced Mary Calkins, who was a great memory researcher who actually went on to become the first president of the APA. The APA stands for the American Psychological Association, which is the biggest psychology professional psychology association that there is in the US, and it is probably regarded as the most important psychological association across countries. So she was the first female to head the APA, and she was actually when she was doing her graduate requirements for getting her PhD. She actually worked with William James that I just mentioned on the previous slide. However, even though she was able to complete all of the required courses, all of the research components needed to get her doctorate in psychology, so this was at Harvard, she was denied this degree. Why? Well, you can probably infer that because of her gender. Then we have Margaret Floyd Washburn, who became the first female to earn a psychology PhD. So as I mentioned, even though Mary Calkins also did all of the coursework, research components, and so forth that were required for getting the PhD, she was denied that degree, and indeed, Dr. Washburn was the first female to actually get it, kind of officially. And she went on to become the second female to head the APA again, which is the American Psychological Association, right? So Margaret Washburn became the second president of the APA. She was also the author of a best-selling book called The Animal Mind, which is very well regarded within the field of psychology even these days. Now we move to the field of behaviorism. So we're going to be talking briefly about some of the trends in psychology, this being one of them. And behaviorism was led by a couple people, uh, although there are a few others. Two prominent people were John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, right? So behaviorists believe that the focus of psychology shouldn't be on an introspection or on the mind or on things that we cannot observe, that we cannot measure well. So they believe that the focus of psychology should be on the study and experimentation with observable behavior, right? So behavior are going to be things that we can see, right, in other people, and therefore we can measure and record in a systematic way, right? So indeed, John B. Watson experimented with conditioned responses. So he did a highly unethical study with a child, which you can see on this slide. You can see a cartoon of it, and we're going to talk about that experiment, that study, in the following modules. And B.F. Skinner studied the field of, and he actually coined the term and kind of established the field of operant conditioning. So he studied the way in which consequences shape the behavior of people. So consequences in this context can be things that punish our behavior, that are going to make it less likely to appear in the future, or things that reinforce our behavior, so that in those instances those consequences will increase the likelihood or strengthen our behavior in the future. And again, as I mentioned, mostly behaviorists saw little value in the use of introspection to collect data, to collect information from people. Then you have Sigmund Freud, who is regarded as the founder of psychoanalysis. So he studied and tried to help people with several kinds of mental disorders. He actually came up with the theory of psychoanalysis as a way to describe psychological disorders in people, but also psychoanalysis is a type of psychological therapy, a type of psychological treatment that he devised, he developed on his own, and of course he's sort of a popular icon. So even people who are not well versed in psychology actually have heard of him. Having said that, we're going to talk more about him in the later in the semester in different modules. So stay put to hear more about Dr. Freud in the future. Then the next trend within psychology is that of humanism. So two prominent figures are going to be Abraham Maslow, who was a researcher only, and then Carl Rogers, who was a mostly a clinical psychologist. So Carl Rogers did a lot of actual clinical work. He did a lot of therapy with people, trying to help them. And the humanists be focus on the ways in which people could actually do better in people who were at times thriving, rather than those who had psychological issues or problems. And they developed theories and treatments to try to help people feel accepted and reach their full potential, right? So this is kind of the complete opposite to psychoanalysis, which focus on kind of the weaknesses and the bad aspects of people, on the negative aspects of individuals. And here we're seeing how people are going to be, through the humanistic view, people are going to be accepted 100% for who they are, because they believe that human beings have this kind of innate value as human beings, and that could be the starting point to treat people with certain problems. Again, this humanistic view is going to come up again probably in future modules of the textbook and of the class, so we may talk more about it in the near future. So having said that, if we take a look back at what we have mentioned about the initial views about psychology, initially people who kind of focus a lot on introspection, especially within the early 1900s, based on their research and on the amount of information available, the definition of psychology was kind of being the science of mental life. And then within the 1920s, we have people like Watson and B.F. Skinner, right, the early behaviorists, who believe that psychology should be the scientific study of observable behavior. So I mentioned because then you can develop systematic ways to measure behavior. Then within the 1950s to the 1960s, we have what's called the cognitive revolution. So in this case, the cognitive perspective will say that psychology should focus on studying mental processes, and this has been typically been also held by neuroscience, which is a similar field of knowledge to psychology, to psychiatry, neurology, and so forth. So within the field of neuroscience, one of the aims is to try to connect, in a way, try to learn more about certain brain regions and see how certain areas of the brain may be responsible for certain behaviors, certain human emotions, psychological processes, and so forth. So having said that, these days we can kind of combine all of these definitions based on these different views about psychology, about the different trends that we have mentioned, and the current definition of psychology would be that psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. So as we have seen already, the pioneers of psychology, the people who started to work within psychology as a field, originally came from different fields such as physiology, philosophy, medicine, biology, and so forth. So people like Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. He conducted studies looking at the digestive system of dogs. We're going to talk about him later on when we talk about learning and conditioning. Jean Piaget, who was a Swiss a physician as well. He did a lot of work within developmental psychology. We have William James that we just mentioned, and Freud, who was originally so James was a philosopher by training, but later on kind of did work within psychology. We have Sigmund Freud, who was a neurologist and a physician first by training, then a neurologist who became interested in psychology and developed psychoanalysis and so forth. So as we have seen, the advances in the area of psychology have come from people with different backgrounds from different countries who spoke different languages and so forth. And indeed, psychology, even though is regarded as a quite recent discipline, kind of as a young science, has spread rapidly. And one example is this international organization, which is called the International Union of Psychological Science, in which there are 71 member nations with people from from all of these 70 countries, and again, who give their significant contributions to the field of psychology. And indeed, as we'll see, in a way, the subfields of psychology have multiplied as well. So there are many new developments that were not present 40 or 50 years ago. Now we turn to one of the biggest questions within psychology and other fields, which is that of the nature versus nurture issue, right? So some of the questions are, to what extent are our traits or characteristics kind of already set in place? So that's kind of due to biology, genetics, and so forth. So that's going to be the nature part. Another question is, to what extent do these traits and characteristics develop as a response to our environment experience? So that would be our nurture, right? So anything that's not part of our genetics is going to be part of nurture, part of our environment, right? So another example or another question is, are gender differences or sex differences, which by the way are not exactly the same, are these biologically predisposed or socially constructed, right? So keep those questions in mind, because we're going to come back to those later on. So people who endorse the nature view, kind of the nativistic view, such as Plato, would say that there are ideas such as what's good and what's considered beauty, and he'll say that those are kind of inborn and not learned, right? Then about the nurture view, you have somebody like Aristotle, who was sort of an empiricist, who will say that all knowledge comes through our senses, right? So if you were to tell Aristotle that it was raining or snowing outside, he will have to see it for himself, to experience it through his senses, in order for him to actually believe that it was raining, right? Then you have Rene Descartes, who said that some ideas are just innate, such as the ones posited by Plato. Then you have a complete empiricist, again, somebody who will endorse the nurture view, such as John Locke, who introduced the idea of the blank slate. So he believed that everything that we come to be, everything that we learn and so forth, comes through our experience with people, with the environment and so forth. And then one of the biggest kind of nativists will be Charles Darwin, who introduced the concept and the idea of natural selection. So he believed that it is through natural selection that some of our characteristics are passed on to the next generation, and those characteristics that prove to be more adaptive in one environment will make it to the next generation, right? So the caveat here is that because many times this idea of the survival of the strongest, of the fittest, right, is in a way misconceived, right? So it is actually not what I just said a minute ago, right? So it doesn't refer to the survival of the strongest. So the survival of the fittest refers to how, again, certain characteristics might be adaptive in this context, which may not be so adaptive in a different context, right? So that's all that we are seeing here. So, as a sort of summary on this question about nature versus nurture, we can say that we share sort of a common origin that give us some sort of innate or inborn human potential, human characteristics that are common to all of us. So it's kind of the genetic part, the biological part, and so forth. And the other part, the nurture, will come through the environment and how it will have effects on the way in which we grow up to, in which we develop, right, and so forth. And the environment can be kind of anything that you can think of that's out there. So this could be the interactions that we have with people, our home environment, our upbringing, the kind of friends that we end up having, the kind of school that we go to, our hobbies, and so forth. All of those represent a part of this environment that are going to have effects on the sort of innate and inborn aspects that we all have in common. So instead of thinking about which one is more important, we can think about nature via nurture. So in other words, the environment, in this case nurture, will work on whatever is already there due to nature, right? And of course, we're gonna come back to this question throughout the semester multiple times, because this can be represented in different ways depending on what is it that we are talking about, right? So for example, if you consider psychological disorders or particular medical conditions, well, there's for some of them a greater genetic and biological component to consider, and there are others in which the environment and kind of nurture is more relevant to consider, right? However, we're gonna get to those examples as we move on in the class. So for now, this is in a way sufficient coverage of this topic. So now we turn to kind of the three levels of analysis that we can use to assess psychological topics. So particularly the approach that we are going to be using in this class. So this is what's referred to as the biopsychosocial model, right? So it has three parts, right? So the bio one refers to people's biology. So that's kind of the first or the deepest level. So this biology includes people's genetics, people's genes, our brain, if there are any differences in our brains, neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are going to be the chemicals that are within our brain that helps different areas of the brain to communicate with one another. We're going to talk more about those in the following modules, about survival, about reflexes, about sensation. And then in the middle you have the psycho part, the psychological aspect that deals with people's thoughts, emotions, moods, choices, decisions, behaviors, motivations, perceptions, and so forth. And then the sort of outer level refers to the environment, which includes social influences, interactions, people's culture, education, and relationships. Then, as I mentioned, this is the biopsychosocial model, and this is just to give you an example of how things such as depression, intelligence scores, enjoying soccer in this case, or in particular sport, whether somebody's shy or extroverted, and so forth. How of those behaviors, situations, characteristics can be explained based on biological influences, right, as I just mentioned, which may be inclusive of genetics, brain mechanisms, changes in hormones, for example. Then you have the psychological influences, people's emotions, learned fears and expectations, ways of thinking, etc. Then you have the environmental influences, which include the social and cultural ones, the presence of others, right? Parents, society, the expectations of family, peer influences, that of the influences of others around you, and so forth. Now we turn into the fields within psychology, the particular subfields we conduct what's considered basic research, right? So basic research refers to research that tries to find answers to sort of universal questions and come up with universal principles that can be applied to large groups of people, to large groups of individuals, or we're talking about animal research to groups of animals, right? So indeed, basic research is the one mostly conducted within laboratories, within labs. Within basic research, the people conducting these studies typically use actual experiments, which we're going to talk about later on. And again, the findings coming from basic research are not necessarily applicable to day-to-day events or to practical problems that we may be facing, right? However, in the future, many times findings from basic research may become applicable and may indeed become part of applied research, which is the topic of the following slide. And indeed, having said that, a lot of times basic research is conducted with animals, right? However, sometimes it is conducted with people, with humans as well, right? But again, most of the time and many times it's going to be using animal subjects or participants. So these are some examples of the different subfields within psychology that conduct this kind of basic research. So biological, developmental, cognitive. So cognitive refers to ways of thinking. So anytime that we see the word cognitive, we're talking about ways of thinking that may be different between people, between individuals, and between groups of people. Personality, social psychology, and positive psychology, right? So here you see kind of the running example of the approaches that each of these subfields may take to the study of children diagnosed with autism. So this is just to exemplify the different subfields present here, right? Now we turn into applied research. So applied research, contrary to basic research, tends to tackle what are considered practical problems, practical issues that typically affect our day-to-day activity, right? So having said that, applied research is typically conducted with humans, with people, and these are some of the examples within psychology. So clinical psychology and counseling psychology. So those are going to be two subfields where the professionals there are going to be conducting clinical work, kind of psychological treatment, psychological therapy, so forth. You have educational psychology, kind of within that area we may find school psychologists, right? People who work with children at schools and so forth. You have IO psychology, industrial organizational. So these are going to be the people who maybe work at a factory trying to improve the improve productivity, maybe enhancing the division of labor and so forth. They have community psychology. These are going to be the people working here who might work within a given city or the government to come up with public health policies and so forth. So having said that, basic and applied research are not kind of exclusive of one another, again, because one informs the other. So sometimes what starts as being a type or the findings coming from basic research will eventually become applied research and so forth. And sometimes applied research, the findings from these kind of studies will inform basic research and vice versa, as I just mentioned. So how does psychology fit within other disciplines? So first of all, it should be differentiated from medicine and from medical practitioners, healthcare providers, because psychologists are, first of all, not physicians. They're not MDs. So this will be psychiatrists who are, first of all, trained as general practice physicians, MDs, and then they eventually specialize into psychiatry so that they can actually prescribe medication, right? So they typically prescribe medication for psychiatric, psychological disorders. That's kind of the training that they receive. They're not kind of well trained to do psychological therapy, talk therapy, and so forth, right? Which is indeed the realm of clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists. So those are gonna be doing almost exactly the same. The main difference is that clinical psychologists are gonna be seeing kind of more severe cases of individuals with psychological and psychiatric disorders, and counseling psychologists are gonna be seeing the less severe cases, right? So maybe somebody with clinical depression will see a clinical psychologist, and maybe somebody having issues with their marriage, with their romantic relationship, may see a counseling psychologist and so forth. So that's at the PhD level. So clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists have PhDs, so doctoral degrees on their respective fields. And you have people working at the master's level, at times with degrees such as a master's degree in social work. Also, there's another similar one called clinical social work. And then counselors at the master level, marriage and family therapists, again, which all are together with the people at the PhD level, are all trained to do psychological treatment. Again, at different levels and with slight differences between one and another. So now we turn to some particular applications of findings coming from psychology, and particularly some study methods that have proven to be effective in helping people study and review certain topics. So the test and effect refers to how whenever we try to test ourselves, kind of quiz ourselves, trying to come up with the specific answer to a question when we are reading, that will help us better remember it in the future, right? So one example can be as starting to read a paragraph from your textbook and then kind of coming up with your own question before you finish with the reading, and then after you finish the reading, trying to come up with the answer without looking back to the text, right? So that's an example of this practice effect, right? So you're actually coming up, kind of creating, developing the own answer, right? And then after that you will check to see whether you got it right or not, and then you can refocus on what is that you need to go back and study. Trying to process the material in an active way, so in a way trying to put it into your own words, right? Whatever you just read, you cannot explain it to your grandma, put it into kind of simpler terms and so forth, then that may be one sign that you need to go back to the material and study a little bit more. Also, trying to make connections to your day-to-day activities, making it personally relevant to you. Also, space rehearsal or space study is much better than cramming uh, or mass practice, right? So it would be better to always spread out your studying over multiple days. So imagine that you were to excuse me, that you were to devote that, let's say, 5 hours of study time for this class per week. You will be much better if you, let's say, if you study 1 hour each day for 5 days than if you were to study for 5 hours the day before the exam, right? So that's why what this space rehearsal refers to. Then the last bullet point here is that people tend to overestimate how much do they know, right? So if a concept looks familiar but you don't know it kind of by heart, maybe you haven't mastered it, and that may not be good enough in order for you to do well on the actual exams or the actual quizzes. Then one particular study method that was pointed out in this textbook is called the SQ3R method, which is similar to what is mentioned. So this method proposes that it is good to first survey and kind of skim throughout your textbook. So not starting to read kind of in detail, but looking at the headers, looking at the outlines, maybe at the bold terms and so forth of a given chapter, and then based on the practice effect on the instance in which I mentioned, in which you may come up with your own questions, right? So come up with your own questions, maybe write down somewhere on your textbook the answer, and then try to come up with more guesses, and then see how many do you get right, so you can go back to it and focus on what it is that you don't know that well, right? And then also reading in small chunks, right? So maybe 10 pages, or starting with five pages at a time, and maybe taking breaks so that you don't lose yourself on the reading. And then try to recall and kind of again rehearse and kind of repeat and put into your own words what is it that you just went over, and then look over the text and the notes and try to come up with sort of the main ideas of the chapter as a sort of review.